käsitellään niin kuin koko paletti. So I propose now that we can speak either in Finnish or in English or Swedish, but especially the questions for Ditte in English or Swedish, and to the others the questions may be given in Finnish as well. So who wishes to take the floor first? Juha, sinä jäät äsken väliin, niin Juha Ruikko MTK:sta.
Joo, niin puheenjohtaja totesi, mä oon Juha Ruikko MTK:sta, ja tuossa oikeastaan Pekka Pesoselle voisin osoittaa kysymyksen kyllä sinällä, että tässä on puhuttu paljon strategisesta kumppanuudesta USA-EU-välillä ja tavallaan sillä saatavista hyödyistä. Tässä on näkökulmia näkynyt vähän tuolla Twitterissäkin siitä, että mitä se voisi olla. Mutta toisaalta niin mä voisin kääntää sen toisinperin niin, että kun maatalouspuolelta seuraat asiaa, niin minkälaisia ajatuksia se herättää, kun jotenkin tuntuu, että Balin paketti ei riittänyt, että seuraava Genevessä tuntuu olevan halu keskustella jostakin muustakin kuin mitä post-Bali-ohjelma sinällään piti sisällään. Mitkä nämä seuraavat stepit on? Sä mainitsit hyvin mun mielestä sen huomioon, että tässä tavallaan niin avattiin tietynlainen Pandoran lipas ja pistettiin asioita liikkeelle. Riittääkö meillä kyky reagoida olemassa oleviin ehdotuksiin niin, että me saadaan järkevässä aikataulussa niistä ratkaisuja, ettei taas tule seuraavan 13 vuoden pätkää, että odotellaan, että milloin kokoonnutaan seuraavaksi Balilla tekemään uusia avauksia.
No, se Bali oli hyvä lähtölaukaus sille, että pystyttiin osoittamaan, että monenkeskinen kauppapolitiikan prosessi toimii. Ja siinä suhteessa kaikki oli kohtuullisen tyytyväisiä sen lopputulokseen. Se seuraava kierros tulee koskemaan nimenomaan, jos maataloutta ajatellaan, niin se koskee asioita, jotka tulee olemaan huomattavasti vaikeimpia neuvotella, joista ei vielä Balissa pystytty sopimaan. Ja nimenomaan ensimmäisenä tietysti tulee tämä vientikilpailu, joka Euroopan unionilla on ollut itse asiassa suhteellisen helpompi kuin meidän kauppakumppaneille, koska EU on tehnyt nämä kotitehtävät jo tähän mennessä valmiiksi. Meidän vientituki, se vanha taso, mitä meillä on ollut, niin on käytännössä kokonaan hävinnyt, ja me käytännössä ollaan niin kuin siellä saavalla puolella nimenomaan suhteessa meidän kauppakumppaneihin. Toinen asia, mikä tietysti tulee olemaan aika iso kysymysmerkki, on nimenomaan tämän sisäiseen tukeen liittyvät kysymykset, jotka mahdollisesti, kun ne sitten avataan, niin on nimenomaan sitten kysymys siitä, että mikä tuki katsotaan niin kuin vääristäväksi ja miten kohdellaan esimerkiksi sitä niin sanottu vihreitä tukea, jonka piirissä eurooppalaisen maatalouden tuki on suuremmalta osin tällä hetkellä. Sieltä tulee aika nopeasti tällaisia isoja periaatteellisia kysymyksiä pöydälle. Kuitenkin niin kuin meidän tärkein kysymys tässä kahdenvälisessä neuvottelussa on se, että me saataisiin nimenomaan tämä niin kuin kaupallinen puoli ja markkinalogiikka ja nämä säännökset saataisiin nimenomaan länsimaiselle linjalle EUn ja Yhdysvaltojen yhdessä tekeminä. Todennäköisesti Japani ja Kanada tulee automaattisesti siihen mukaan nimenomaan niin kuin meidän näistä suurista kumppaneista. Ja siinä suhteessa tämä kokonaisuus tietysti pelaa yhteen. Että jos me saadaan kahdenvälinen aikaisiksi ja vaikka se monenkeskinen sitten etenisi siinä rinnalla, niin ne täydentää toisiaan, ei suinkaan niin kuin poissulje toisiaan. Ja niin kuin iso riski tähän niin kuin meidän näkökulmasta on se, että nimenomaan Euroopan, perhaps I say this in English just to make sure that our Commission representative would also get the message, is that the simple fact that if the European Union is to engage at multilateral level and bilateral level in several occasions, especially with US and Mercosur, that would mean that we would have substantially step up our resourcing to the negotiation process itself. And this is not within the reasonable expectations, especially given the realities in the Commission. And that's why we have had some major concerns when it comes to opening the Mercosur negotiation parallel to especially TTIP. Because that would be both politically but also as a process would be too heavy.
Okay, kiitoksia. Timo.
Suomeksi pari kommenttia. Kiitoksia Pekalle ja Jaakolle erinomaisesta puheenvuorosta. Ensin Timo Muuri, Kauppakamari. Ensiksi 2 kommenttia. Kiitoksia Pekalle ja Jaakolle erinomaisesta puheenvuorosta. Pekka toi tavallaan fiksusti esille tämän globaalin standardien luomisen myös maatalous- ja elintarvikepuolelle, mitä täällä myös korostettiin MTK-puolesta. Just näinhän se on. Ja Jaakolle, hienoa, että tällaisia yrittäjiä löytyy. Pitäisi olla Suomessa enemmän, mutta onneksi meillä on kohta 3D-tulostin, että voidaan tehdä sitä kautta uusia innokkaita yrityksiä vallottamaan maailmaa. But then question to Titte, you refer to the multilateral policy and so on. We know that trade policy normally takes time, especially this multilateral negotiation and probably also this EU-US negotiation. And those are that kind of long-term perspective issues which companies sometimes has a bit challenging to follow up and see the real added value because it takes time. But in the everyday life, the companies today are facing different kind of challenges, including relocalization requirements or double taxation and so on. Could you, in general, comment the role of the EU trade policy and how you can help the companies in that kind of a specific question at the same time when you're negotiating with the USA and other WTO members? But please open up these kind of practical issues and how you can help the companies in that kind of everyday challenges.
Okay. Perhaps we go so that Ditte, if you may answer first, and then we move to Pekka.
Okay, very good. Indeed, trade policy and European trade policy is a question of an immediate agenda, a short or longer term agenda. It's clear that negotiations, depending on their complexity and the partner and the scope of issues to be addressed, can take longer time, and it's clear that multilateral takes longer. The gains are bigger, so it's a worthwhile investment, but it also means we have to negotiate smaller agreements in parallel to ensure faster gains, essentially. In the very immediate term, we have a set of monitoring and enforcement instruments, both to tackle specific market access barriers that European enterprises face across the world. We have our market access database and our market access initiative that allows European Commission teams to work efficiently and effectively together with member state teams in our delegations throughout the world to solve specific irritants. We have a significant agenda with strategic partners, so countries with which we're not necessarily negotiating a free trade agreement, but where we have other elements or other instruments for cooperation to solve disputes. So there's a very active monitoring and enforcement agenda, both by political instruments, high-level meetings, but also dispute settlement or more informal forms of consultation to solve disputes. The second step in the enforcement or in the concrete interest agenda is the dispute settlement. Again, it's a tool that is rather heavy, relatively time-consuming, so it's not used for smaller irritants. We always try to solve problems by other means, but if it's not possible or if we have market access issues or concerns that are more systemic and long-term in nature, it can be necessary to make use of dispute settlement. A good example, or a couple of good examples where we have used dispute settlements in the last couple of years is concerns in relation to export restrictions. You may recall China's restrictions on the exports of rare earth, where we brought a case in the WTO because the concern was systemic. It was a longer-term concern that had to be solved at a more fundamental level, and we have now succeeded in bringing a successful outcome, full support in the case. We see similar export restrictions elsewhere in the world, and therefore also for those from that broader perspective, it's important to challenge. Similarly, we have seen, since Russia joined the WTO, we've seen a number of trade irritants and measures put in place by Russia that require intervention. We have a very active ongoing dialogue to try to solve these issues, but some of them are of a nature where we have found it necessary to apply dispute settlement. So an instrument that is extremely important to have for us in our toolbox in terms of solving issues. And that's then the more medium term, and as you rightly said, the longer term are negotiations where we have to find a balance between negotiations that are relatively simpler, either because they're bilateral or where we have a smaller scope of negotiations and where we can try to bring swifter outcomes, and then the longer term interest in the multilateral system that will have to remain the pillar, but that has to be complemented by other negotiations. Maybe just a comment on the question of managing several negotiations in parallel, because we do have a very busy negotiating agenda. I mentioned bilateral negotiations, I mentioned some of the plurilateral negotiations, and of course the fact that the Doha Development Agenda WTO negotiations are being reactivated and will also call for resources. It's clear that when we plan our negotiations, we are fully aware of the need to plan them not just each individually, but also to take account of the linkages between the two or between the different negotiations and the impact of one negotiation or another. So, for example, in some sectors, negotiating US, Mercosur was mentioned, WTO as well, is a challenge that has to be addressed. We cannot engage in several negotiations and pay the same thing several times. So there's a very significant work of coordination, ensuring coherence between negotiations so that we get our sequencing right and also that we get our priorities right, in the sense that TTIP clearly currently has a very high priority in EU trade policy. We have to make sure, and we do make sure, that we devote sufficient resources to those negotiations so as to handle seriously, and that will have an impact on the exact timing and what can be done in other negotiations, because they have to be coordinated between themselves. That's also a reason that if you look at it simply practically, realistically, in terms of the multilateral agenda, it's clear that there will have to be more progress and a number, just as a matter of fact, not because we say it has to be like that, but because a number of significant WTO partners are engaged in bilateral negotiations that will have an impact on the exact scheduling of negotiations in WTO. And that's why we think, in terms of results at the multilateral level, it is more realistic to look at 2017 as the moment where we hope to close the Doha Development Agenda negotiations. I hope that answered your question.
That was a good answer. Pekka, you do something?
Perhaps I also respond in English, but when it comes to our general interest and in terms of what we are aiming to accomplish, first of all, we have to point out that for farmers, single farmers, individual farmers, it doesn't make any difference what sort of an agreement we have with the US or anyone else directly, because normally a farmer doesn't, let's say, relate to export market in the first place. This is about businesses and hopefully small and medium-sized enterprises in the Union. European Union is very strong in this, and other parts of my work, for instance, very much engage micro-enterprises, for instance, their ability to cope with the European Union structures, and especially international trade. And this is something that we fully support. The European Commission is committed to make it work also for the small end of the scale. And this is really important for all of us, not only the multinational and the big enterprises. Second point that I would like to point out or raise here is that despite the fact that we talk about free trade agreements, all too often it's a matter of how the agreement itself is being implemented. And I only raise one particular example, and that is free trade agreement with Canada. You may know that when we discussed the outcome, the expectation de facto was that the tariff TRQ management was to be, let's say, aligned with quite recent decisions of the Union in other trade-related areas, and that would have been that it would be first come first served basis. But then this would have given the dominance of the market and the dominance of the international trade in this respect to the bigger players, because they would have the ability to respond in a quicker pace. We pushed, together with some of the member states, a different management method of this part. And European Union, I think you can confirm this, European Commission wasn't in favor of this in the first place. And at the end of the day, I think this is now being discussed. Well, that's a technicality with the Canadian deal, but the point here is that the devil still lies in the detail. If and when we have an agreement, it's very much how that is being implemented, and especially from the smaller business side point of the market, because all too often these, let's say, bureaucratic structures and operations, procedures are very prohibitive. If they enter the, for instance, in this case, Canadian market, we are talking about small volumes that proportionally would have to carry a significant administrative cost, and it would never work. So I would like to demonstrate by this example that it is also how we put in place these agreements in the future. And I believe that in the US, this in relative terms even is more important because of the huge scope of the agreement. I think Mr. Van Hoykelen from the cabinet of Mr. Van de Kocht said very famously that we are talking about the mother of all agreements when we talk about the agreement between US and EU.
Okay, but before I give the last, take the last questions, I would like to ask actually Jaakko. Thank you. That was very energetic view how one should do things to be successful. But you mentioned that your services can enter quite easily to the US markets because of its nature. But haven't you encountered any trade barriers at all during your way to the States?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Yeah, nothing. Because it's we are using, for example, Braintree banking service, so it automatically does all the like our money transfers and all that kind of issues. So it's like for our kind of companies. I don't maybe later when we are bigger, but right now I really feel. But I have to say that like being here, I'm so happy that there are so clever people in Finland like handling this kind of issue. So we as entrepreneurs, we can do our thing, and there are so wise people doing other things. So I'm so happy.
Yeah, the best way is that you do it because you give the employment we want. But other questions, Ilkka, my deputy from External Economic Relations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marco. Thank you for the very good presentations by all of you. I have a question related to the economic impact and the benefits accruing on the TTIP agreement and perhaps more general from any trade agreements. I think Pekka quite well pointed out that what we import from the US, it's pretty much primary products in the area of agriculture, but we export more higher value-added products there. So my question to Dieter would probably be that, you know, how much do you analyze this point? I mean, in addition to the traditional balance between tariff concessions, I mean, how much do you look at the value-added side? I mean, and do you agree that this would be the thing which should be the decisive point in assessing, for example, the US tariff offer, which has been condemned as unsatisfactory so far? And should you be analyzing these from this value-added point of view, which in the end is something which counts for the companies and also is important then for our national economies when calculating the impact of TTIP or any other trade deal? Thanks.
Good. I continue actually that another question that you heard the idea of this appeal body for investment disputes. How do you see it in the Commission? Is it a realistic view or not? Are there any other questions? Yes, that we'll take, and that is absolutely the last one.
I'm journalist Anna-Liina Kauhanen from the Finnish paper Helsingin Sanomat. My question is about the investment agreement and the ongoing open hearing. How does the Commission actually handle all the points of the view given?
You received quite many answers, I believe. But
yes.
Dieter.
Thank you. Let me take the questions in the order they came in. First, on the economic impact, we have, of course, before we engaged in the TTIP negotiations, carried out economic analysis of the different possible elements of an agreement of the different sectors. So we have the overall view and a good assessment of what are the potential gains. And as we engage in negotiations, we obviously go to a more granular level, looking at sectoral impacts, looking at the value added, as you rightly referred to. It's clear that in negotiating with the US, the value added, the high-level, high-end market is of particular relevance, and that's one of the factors that makes the US market interesting for European companies, for European exporters. The challenge at a European level is, of course, also to make sure that we have the analysis covering the entire EU, relevant sectors, looking at where is the main impact, where are the risks, where are the challenges, and what are the main opportunities in terms of opening the US market. But we are carrying out that analysis, and did carry out that careful analysis also before introducing tariff offers, and of course review the US offer in that light. I think as we are going through negotiations, and as this is a relatively open process where there's a very lively public debate on a number of issues, which is a very good thing in support of negotiations, but it's also difficult, I think, often to assess a negotiating process some way halfway through or a third into the negotiations, because there's a lot of tactics and games that are part of negotiations, so one should be careful not to dive down at a particular moment and take a firm opinion on issues that are under development. So in relation to the different offers, there will be more coming, and it's a process that we are engaged in. But I fully agree with you on the value added being an important element in these particular negotiations, given the US market. On the investor-to-state dispute settlement, investment protection, and the possibility for an appeal mechanism in investor-state dispute settlement, it is, I think, an important aspect, or one of the important elements, and what could be improved as part of investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. There has been a lot of debate, not just within the EU or in individual member states, but also globally. There's been debate in a number of countries of how to handle investment protection in agreements and how to handle investor-state dispute settlement. As part of that debate, some of the criticisms that have been raised about investor-state dispute settlement is a perceived lack of accountability of arbitrators, a lack of predictability, lack of transparency of these processes, partly because these processes are independent arbitration panels that operate. What we try to do in the approach we are suggesting to take in TTIP, and that is what you would see in the public hearing, the documents that have been made public recently. What we've tried to do is to develop instruments that would help make sure that the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism becomes more transparent. We do that by applying the recently agreed UN rules on transparency in arbitration. We were part of the negotiation and helped push towards more transparency there. We will apply them in our future agreements. We're looking at systems for the selection of arbitrators, making sure that there's a code of conduct that arbitrators have to abide to, so that they cannot have, so as to limit the conflict of interest, to make sure that arbitrators that are asked to sit on cases are not at the same time engaged in other operations that could be problematic from a neutrality perspective. One of the more important points is the question of an appeal. Because arbitration awards so far have been final, there are some possibilities for annulment or repeal, but it's limited. It means that the accountability, the clarity, the certainty to have the right ruling, there's no possibility for appeal in the existing system, which has been one of the points that has been criticized. We recognize that as an important point to take up, and what we're looking to do in TTIP is to have agreement with the US to establish an appeal possibility as part of investor-state dispute settlement. What you have out there currently in existing agreements is you have some agreements referring to the possibility to create an appeal mechanism. We would like to take it a step further and actually establish a mechanism. If you start by establishing it bilaterally between the EU and US, one would hope that would be an incentive for others to look at similar models or to link other agreements into that. But that is more of a longer term perspective. In the immediate term, the key point is to ensure that there would be a strong appeal mechanism as part of the EU-US investment part of the agreement. In terms of the public consultation, this is one of the questions, one of the issues we've put out there. We've sought to explain what it could function like, what it could look like in terms of the legal text. It is one of the issues where we hope to have comments and input that would allow us to further refine our approach analyze the comments and questions that come in so as to make sure we get it right. The public consultation was launched by the end of March. It will be made available in all EU languages. I'm not sure all languages are online yet, but they will be there soon. And the consultation will be open for 3 months, counting from the day that all languages are available. We already have a number of replies, so there's clearly a high degree of interest, which is a good thing. As I said, we hope to have substance input that will address some of the key issues we've set out there, some of the suggestions for improvement, some of the suggestions for more transparency, accountability, clarity of the rules, the balance between the protection of the investor and the right to regulate, the assurances that we try to build in both to the substantive rules but also to the enforcement mechanisms. So we hope to have comments on those so that we can make sure that we build the best possible system, because we do have a unique opportunity here with the US, including hopefully to integrate an appeal mechanism in the system.
Okay, thank you so much. Now we have to finish off. I apologize, we have passed the deadline by 8 minutes. I would like to thank you, our excellent speakers, for their interventions, and thank you for very relevant questions, and would like to wish all the best for our young entrepreneurs and for our lobbying organizations, and especially, of course, all the success for the Commission to bring these negotiations forward. I can't now announce the next public hearing. Surely we will continue with these negotiations with the tanker of gas. Will continue, but let's see now after the European elections how we handle the next get-together. But surely we will have more public hearings, and surely the openness with this file will continue in the future as well. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you.